So I'm going to show you a brief introduction to illustrate how I get my Commodore 64 onto the internet, or at least the precursor to the internet, which is the bulletin board system that was fairly popular during the 80s. So first of all, what are we going to need? What does this look like? Obviously a Commodore 64. If I turn this up, this back, you can see that what we've got is an SD card adapter here so that we can get software onto the Commodore without having to load tapes. That plugs into the disk drive connector and takes some power from here as well. We also have our video out going to the TV. We also have a connector plugged into the user port on the Commodore. This is a connector that you can get off of eBay. I'll put a link up for that. Amazing that you can still get hold of these things. This connects over something called a COM port, serial port. I'm going to use an FTDI adapter for that. More on that a little bit later on. So getting our Commodore onto the internet isn't rocket science, but then neither is it trivial. So I've drawn a little diagram to illustrate how this is going to work. First of all, we've got our Commodore 64 down here, and as we mentioned, that we need to plug into the user port, connect into the user port to get that connected to the outside world. To do this, we're going to use something called an FTDI cable. Basically, in days gone by, what we would have been able to do is make an adapter to convert the 5-volt logic that comes out of the user port into the plus or minus 12-volt logic used on an RS-232 port. PCs often don't have an RS-232 port these days. You often have to use an adapter. The fortunate thing with this adapter is it gives us 5-volt logic level outputs, which means that we can connect that directly to the user port. What we need to do therefore is get hold of one of these FTDI cables, and that looks something like this. So we have on one end a USB connection. There's actually some electronics in here that converts from USB to serial and gives 5-volt logic outputs on these wires here. Now, for this project we only need the ground TX and RX lines, which according to our diagram are orange, yellow and black. The orange wire we need to connect into pins B and C on the user port. The yellow wire we need to connect into pin M on the user port, and black onto pins A and N. Fortunately, the connector that I used is labelled with these pin numbers on the connector itself. But what you need to make sure is that you plug it into the user port the right way round. The wiring, all of these connections should be on the bottom as the connector plugs into the user port. Okay, so what does this do? This gives us basically a connection from the Commodore 64 out to the PC. Now that's over something called RS-232 or serial protocol. So what we need to do is we need to install some terminal software, or run some terminal software. We didn't install back in those days. Run some terminal software on the Commodore 64. We then need something on the PC that will basically convert our RS-232 signals that are coming on a COM port across and send them out over Wi-Fi or Ethernet via our router onto the internet. For that we're going to use something called Leaf's BBS software, and I'll show you that a little bit later on. Once we're out on the internet then, we need to, via our terminal software, make a connection to a bulletin board. Now, bulletin boards come from the days of dial-up, where what we would do is connect via a modem directly to another computer and exchange information with it. You only had a limited number of users on each bulletin board, so you could only send mail, for instance, to the users of that bulletin board. They didn't talk to each other. Today, a lot of people are putting bulletin boards using the old software, the old systems, directly onto the internet so you can connect to them with TCP/IP. and that's exactly what we're going to do. So from the Commodore 64 we're going to make a serial connection through the PC and effectively dial our bulletin board using an IP address or using a domain name. Okay, so once we're set up and we've connected our FTDI cable between the PC and the Commodore and installed the drivers, we should be able to see that we've got a new COM port on the PC. If you look here, ports COM and LPT in Device Manager, and to get Device Manager press Windows key and break. You can see that what we've got is our USB serial port on COM3, and this is the FTDI device. Now we can test this fairly simply by running a terminal program on the PC and terminal software on the Commodore. To connect to the Commodore 64 and test what we're doing, we're going to use something called Putty. Putty is a piece of software that you may be familiar with if you're used to using the Raspberry Pi. Putty can talk over SSH, a secure socket host, to the Raspberry Pi. In this case we're going to use a serial connection on COM3, which is the COM port from Device Manager, for our FTDI device, and we're going to run at the massive speed of 1200 baud, which is 1200 bits per second. And here's our terminal window with nothing on it at the moment. To put 1200 bits per second into context, we're used to these days running maybe at 10 or 30, 40, 50 megabits per second, 50 million bits per second with our internet connections on broadband today. So whilst 1200 bits per second was pretty rapid and high tech back in the day, it's really pedestrian right now. Okay, so over to the Commodore now. The first thing that we need to do on the Commodore is load the terminal software that we're talking about. So using the SD card adapter, you need to type load quote FB, which is our file browser, comma 8, and run. This just takes a little while, and then we can navigate through the menus, Commodore 64, and we're going to load a piece of software, as I mentioned, called CCGMS. In this case I'm recommending version 13.1. There are various versions of this piece of software that have been modified by different people for different specific purposes. 13.1 seems to work, so we're going with that one. Okay, so after a little while CCGMS will load up. What we need to do is check the settings in here are correct. So I'm going to press F7 for dialer params. And as you can see here, what we've done is we've got the baud rate set to 1200 to match what we set up in the terminal program. Okay, let's return to abort and let's type something. So let's type HELLO. Now you can see that nothing's actually appearing on the screen because we haven't set up the terminal to echo back the data. Okay, over at the PC now, if I type some text into Putty, hello, you can see that that text is coming out on the Commodore. At the same time now, if we type on the Commodore, we should see it coming out on the Putty terminal. And there we go. How are you doing today? Okay, so we've proved now that we've got good communications between the Commodore and the PC at 1200 baud. What we need to do then is close down the Putty terminal application and run our Telnet BBS server, which is Leaf's BBS server. I'll put a link up for that. One thing you might need to do when you download Leaf's BBS server is, because it's a Visual Basic application, there are two OCXs that you might need to register. What you need to do is to copy those two files into the Windows System 32 folder and run reg svr32 at the command prompt. But when you do this, you need to open up the command prompt as an administrator, so you can do that on the start menu under applications. Once you've got Telnet BBS server up and running, there are a couple of things you need to check. First of all, you need to check that the COM port in there is set to the COM port of the FTDI cable, in this case COM3. The other thing that you need to check is on the advanced tab that we're set to the right baud rate. So in this case, the serial COM should be 1200 baud, comma N for no parity, comma 8 for 8 data bits, comma 1 for 1 stop bit. So it's 1200 N 8 1. Once that's all up and running, then we should be ready to go. This is telling us that we've got an OK message there. That comes through from Leaf's BBS server. When we get that up and running, we can then start to send something called AT commands. Now, AT commands go back to the days of modem. They're what were known as attention commands. Basically a whole bunch of commands that begin with the letters AT. The first one, if I go ATI, that requests information. So we can see here Telnet BBS server 1.4a and the IP address of the PC that this is connected to. Now, when we wanted to dial a telephone number in the old days, we used to use the command ATDT to dial, and then what we need to do is enter a telephone number. Now, in this case, we're not dialing with a modem a telephone number. We're connecting to a bulletin board directly over the internet, so we want to enter the address of that, which is cib.dynds.org. For the CIB bulletin board, and we need to enter colon 6401, which is the 01, which is the port number to connect to. And here we go, Commodore image to BBS connecting. And there we go, colour Commodore graphics. And we're connected to a bulletin board. You can see how wonderfully fast the download speed is. You know, very much old school, very much let's say war game style. Let's check if we've got any mail. No mail today, and let's log in. So it's telling us now the last 5 callers on the bulletin board. So actually this one gets quite a lot used, really. I'm not going to read what's on the wall. I'm not going to read network graffiti. You know, it was a bulletin board. People would post messages, people would send email to each other. But as I pointed out, it's really limited to the other users of this particular system, because there was no universal means of exchanging email, for instance. I'm not going to read that. I'm going to go straight to the main menu. Oh, it seems like I have 3 pieces of mail. Let's not read those now. Right, so we're at the main menu. Let's hit question mark to see some options. BBS listings, electronic mail, movie files, program files. Let's have a look at program files. See if we can find some games. Yep, let's have a look at the game room. User versus user, CI Casino, Brain Busters, Sport, Hackers Heaven, Fortune Teller. Well, no global thermonuclear war, but all the same, I'm going to have a little bit of a wander around and play here and see what email I've been left. Okay, so we're done with games now, so let's go back to the main room and let's quit. So it gives us a summary of today's call, and let's disconnect. And that should basically give us a goodbye message. We don't want to leave any feedback, not today. Goodbye, thanks for calling again, and it's listing a few other boards that we might be interested in taking a look at. And you can see no carrier, which means it's dropped the line in the old days of modems. Okay, that's my tutorial. Hopefully that was interesting for you. Hopefully if you've got a Commodore, or in fact for that matter many other forms of computer, you can get them onto some of the old bulletin board systems that still exist. I'm going to post a list on here, or a link to a list of bulletin boards that are active that you can take a look at. So have fun.